Thank you for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Govern. So again, in the studio with me today, I'm very honored to have Brian Heywood. Thank you so much for staying in the studio with us, Brian, so we can put you under the spotlight here for our viewers and get them to know you a little more. And I'm going to tell you the reason. One of the things I really wanted to talk about is I've been out helping collect signatures in this initiative project, and it's your name right here in the top. You know, maybe not the exact address. That is the capital address here. I always like that. And but that's your name at the top of every one of these initiatives. And anybody that's paid attention to my channel knows I pay attention to the Public Disclosure Commission reports. Your name shows up in there as being heavily involved in the political process, not just in this, but in a lot of other conservative campaigns and activities around the state. And I have to tell you, when I'm out there talking to activists, people are always wanting to know, who is Brian Heywood? What's his background? So I thought, I'm excited to have you here in the studio so that I get a chance to kind of put the spotlight on you and ask you some questions that people ask me about you, and so you get to describe yourself directly to the audience. So first of all, where are you from originally?
I was born and raised in Arizona, just several small little Arizona northern towns.
And I know that you and I have, because I know that you happen to get into a pretty good school as well. Now, not quite as good as the one I went to. No. Anybody that knows me, I mock Columbia all the time. So I did that, you know. But so tell us, where did you end up going to college? And
so I think that at the time they must have had a small rural Arizona quota, but Harvard somehow either mistakenly or for whatever reason accepted me in when I graduated and then what I tell people, though, is I sort of went into Harvard thinking I was a Republican. All of my beliefs got challenged at Harvard, and I came out a very converted conservative because of my Harvard experience.
It was just as left-leaning when you were there.
It was. I would say more so, but I think actually they've been able to top what they were doing. But if you look at it, back in the 80s, it wasn't woke, it was politically correct, and it was the beginning, and all the students that now have become the teachers in the 2000s were learning this political dialogue. Right. And it was the beginning of fear in a way. Like, you didn't want to say certain things because this group or that group might get mad. And then you would say, well, there's political correctness. And people would say at school, no, it's no such thing. You've just made that up. But then you were afraid to write a paper that mentioned certain topics because, well, you might, and we didn't have the word canceled, but it was, you might get a bad grade from your teacher because they didn't agree with your political ideas. Right. And this was, and certainly I wasn't the greatest writer in the world, so perhaps I got bad grades for that too. But and I did okay, actually. I didn't have bad grades, but that was a fear, right? It was the beginning of that, and I saw it back in the early days, and I watched people essentially what we'd now call cancel people.
Right. Well, I like that. Talking about sometimes that background a little bit, just because the perception is if you go to a school like that, or you go to school like I did, at Columbia, the idea is there's no way in heck you could go there and come out a conservative.
Right.
And so the fact that you are able to survive that gauntlet is it ends up telling people a little bit about who you are, and so sometimes that's why I like to bring in some of that background. I don't put the same stock, I don't think, in Ivy League degrees as our friends on the left do, but maybe it's just because I went there. I guess the veneer is off a little bit, but and then from there you spent a lot of time in Japan, and your trip to Japan, I think, is an interesting backdrop because it really has kind of set the stage for who you are a lot today.
So in the middle of college, I was studying Russian, and I was going to be a Soviet studies major, and I thought, what's the greatest thing I could do for the country, sort of this 19-year-old naive mind, what can I do that would be really important for America? And that would be to study Russian, to speak Russian. Andrei Gromyko was the foreign minister of Russia at the time, and he spoke English fluently. And I thought, we need someone on our side that can do that back, right? And this is the middle of the Cold War. So I was studying Russian, and then for my church, when you're 19, you get this opportunity to go serve a mission. If you'd like to, you raise your hand and say, I'll go. And then they tell you where. Okay, you're assigned. And I was excited about where I was going, and there's a small chance I could actually go to Moscow, and that would have been exciting. And sure enough, I went to Osaka, Japan, right? And had to learn.
And not much use for Russian there.
No, zero use for Russian. Yeah. I forgot most of my Russian, but then studied Japanese. And of course, Osaka has a very strong dialect, very different than Tokyo. And so I studied the Hyojungo, the main dialect of Japan, and then they sent me to Osaka, and I had to, again, you're struggling again to learn the new dialect, but it was a life-changing experience. A culture so unbelievably different than what I had grown up with, yet what I really discovered was that even within that very different culture, there were people that reminded me of my mom or my mom's friends. There were people that reminded me of my dad. That people were people, right? That, not to quote Tears for Fears, but, but
gosh, we're getting 80s references
yeah,
all
we're
over
completely,
this.
I'm showing my, well, it's not no surprise how old I am. But it was this life-changing experience where I also learned Japanese over the course of the next 13 years. Well, actually, over the course of about 15 years, I spent 13 of them in Japan.
Okay.
I went back as a student for a year. So after 2 years as a missionary, came back to school for a year, went back to school in Kyoto for a year, studied, came back to the United States, finished, graduated, wrote my senior thesis, and then got married on the way to Japan, drugged my wife, my new bride, to Japan, and we just set up life as a newlywed couple. We set it up in Tokyo.
Okay.
And I started working for a market research firm that was a joint venture partner with J.D. Power and Associates here in the United States.
And so that really gave you, that's what kind of launched you into the business world, was coming
Completely.
out. Yeah, just being in that environment. And now you had that skill, so you're already there. Talk about your business background, because I think that's always interesting. People say, I'm a business guy, but what is your business background and what kind of got you to where you are today?
So one of the things I discovered in Japan is that there were a lot of words and concepts in business, and especially even market research, that I learned in Japanese before I really understood even what the English version. And I don't mean that I didn't understand English, of course I understood it, but there were just phrases that were used that I learned the Japanese equivalent of that, and I would then say, what's that in English? And I would, oh, that's what that word means, right? That would be kind of the way it worked. So I learned business in Japan in a small firm that was growing quickly, so I would talk about sort of being the chief cook and bottle washer, right? You did everything. You cleaned the dishes and then you would help drive things. At a very young age, I was doing things in Japan that 40 and 50-year-olds would that would be an important point in their career when they began to do the things that I was given the opportunity to put my hand at. And I'm sure, I'm glad I can't go back and look at a video of me, because I'm sure I made lots of mistakes.
Sure.
But I learned enormously, because what we were doing with data primarily is we would take these research surveys and the results of the surveys, and we would go in and talk to the presidents and the CEOs of Japanese manufacturers. And it meant that I got to go through probably every automotive factory in Japan and much of Asia before the China explosion, and see how they made things. And then take data into the C-suite and watched how management would react, both negatively and positively, to the data that we were providing. And sometimes you would see a rejection of the fact, I don't want to know, I can't hear you, right? And then sometimes, I remember going in to visit Toyota, and the CEO of Toyota was very much almost a god, in Japan. He would sit with his arms folded, and there's 30 people on each side of him, and they're all watching to see if he's nodded yet. And as we put the data in front of him, he went from this to suddenly leaning forward and looking at the data and asking us questions about it. And I saw the raw power of having information, real, not just data, but sort of analytical data that tells you what's going on. And that heavily influenced my business understanding in my career.
Okay.
It led me ultimately, after working for J.D. Power and Associates, I went to work for an automotive glass company in Singapore. It was a British company that was trying to explore all of Asia. And that, over about 2 years, I was traveling. When I would compare notes with flight attendants, I was flying more than they were around Asia. So I was on a plane a lot, in every back alley, understanding logistics and supply chain for the automotive glass industry. And working with insurance companies in the repair and replacement process. And then Citibank in Japan recruited me to come back. I had done some research work for Citibank prior, when I had lived in Japan, working for J.D. Power. And Citibank asked me to come back and join their retail sales team there in Japan. So I was the head of sales for think we had 36 branches or something like that at the time. And that, again, was another experience where you kind of got to see behind the scenes of how an organization works.
And essentially with that type of business background, you're basically covering finance, you're covering manufacturing, and you're covering supply chain logistics, which in almost entirely in Japan. So
all in Japan,
right.
And in Japanese.
And in Japanese, yeah, right. So what would be, you use an example of words in Japan that there's no, or Japanese, I should say, that there's no equivalent English, or at least you had to learn what the English skills. Do you have any good examples of that?
There's a word that I particularly hate.
Okay.
It's called sontaku. And sontaku is, originally the word sontaku was designed to be a good thing. It was, you would, without being told, you would sort of interpret what your leader or your boss's intentions or needs were, and you would do that thing for them before they would even ask you. And that's a great concept. But what it turns into is an excuse, two things. Either an excuse not to do something, oh, Japan would never let us do that, or Tokyo would never let us do that, or, right, it becomes an excuse, and you assume something that hasn't been stated. They would never let us do it, so we won't even try. So it becomes an excuse, or it would become a power spigot, right, a power display. So if I'm the only one that ever gets to talk to the CEO, and I come and visit your branch or your location, I would tell you, no, the CEO won't allow it. Now, I haven't asked the CEO. I'm just interpreting what I think that the CEO would say if you were to ask him that thing. And so it transfers to me this arbitrary power. And I find in American companies, and European companies, and Indian companies, this concept exists. The big difference is we don't have a word for it.
Okay.
And I talk to the Japanese. It's so entrenched in Japanese society. We have a word for it. And they'll sort of laugh. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Okay.
I spent a lot of time trying to break sontaku.
Okay.
In Japan.
Which is why it's not your favorite
no, that's exactly
Japanese
right.
word.
Exactly.
So you got this business background. You did come back to America, but you used some of those skills then, right, to start doing the business that you've basically been in now for a while. Can you describe that for people so they can understand, just for our viewers, they understand that backdrop?
So we came back to California, and it was in the middle of the dot-com boom. So everyone was getting jobs at dot-coms, and I wanted to do something different. It wasn't the middle, it was at the end of the boom, and we just didn't know it yet. So luckily, I didn't go into the dot-com boom. We instead created a business that is it's a Japanese hedge fund, but we call it a friendly activist fund, which means we take big institutional money, we invest it in public companies in Japan. We take anywhere from 2 to 10% position in public stock in that company, and then go work with management to try to get them, to help them make their company stronger and better. And it seemed incredibly arrogant to say something like that in the 90s, when Japan was still sort of seen as, it hadn't fallen yet. It was falling, but it hadn't fallen. But Japan had sort of lost its way. And the new management that was promoted had sort of lost their way. And they needed someone they could have a sounding board to bounce ideas off and make changes. And that's where we started.
Okay. So you go in, you buy a company, or you invest in companies, and then get enough of a position in them that you can actually influence how they're running their business.
They would listen to us at least, and then if your ideas are terrible, then they don't meet with you as much. Right. If your ideas make things happen, or change the way they see things, or help them solve problems, then they'll meet with you more often. And that's that was the critical element to our succeeding, was taking data analysis and information to CEOs that they could then use within their company to make things better.
Now, eventually you moved out of California and came to Redmond.
We did.
And what was the big deciding point as to why you wanted to move your company up here?
Very honestly, it was taxes.
Okay.
We saw taxes, they were hitting 13, 14% for individuals in California.
Right.
Plus all other kinds of add-ons. And so when we calculated out, our marginal rate in California was somewhere north of 67%.
Okay.
That means for every dollar we earned, only 33 cents were coming back to us. And that's just, why would you work when over 50% is not coming to you?
Right.
And we could see it was going to get worse. And so we talked with our employees, and we looked around, and we looked at different places we could move. We also had a very Japanese staff. Over half of our staff are either Japanese American or Japanese nationals. and that speak Japanese.
So you need to stay on the West
We
Coast.
needed something that had an Asian cultural influence.
Okay.
So I mean, we could have. We looked in the center of the country, and we looked at Florida, but
Right.
But we also were flying to Japan a lot.
Right.
And so Washington State was this beacon of no taxes in the state.
Right.
And so we
No
said, well,
income
let's,
taxes,
no
anyway.
income taxes.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And we said, well, let's go look at it. And I hadn't been here, and it turns out I've got relatives. My grandfather, my mom's dad. I met him once, but his family was from Elk, over near Spokane.
Yeah, just north of Spokane. Yep.
I still haven't been over to see the cemeteries and all that, but I sort of discovered I have roots here, and that made it interesting. And then we flew in, and you fly in when you fly into Seattle when it's not cloudy, and you see this network of beautiful water laced with green fingers going out into the water, and it's
Right.
just and you're passing by these volcanic ice-capped mountains on the way, and it was just stunning. And so my partners and I, as we came here and we looked at the beauty and then the sort of financial freedom that was available here, we decided to make the move, and we offered to pay for everybody in our office to move with us. And we thought we'd lose our admins, but our admins all convinced their husbands to go find a job in Washington. So we brought almost 40 families up here to Washington State back in 2010.
2010, okay. So 12 years ago. And so that's what kind of laid the foundation for your involvement in Washington right now. And ultimately, probably seeing what happened in California. Now, I know you've said you were involved a little bit politically down there too, but now you're up here and you become so involved in the political process in Washington State. How much of your experience in California is influencing your just extensive involvement right now in the political process up here?
Well, I've had an interest in politics since I was 6, right? So this has always been there, but I found that business is what got me excited. So that was the background there, but in California, what we found was that we almost felt like we were overwhelmed. Like it didn't matter what we did. I'm saying we in a royal we sort of citizens, right? There was going to be new regulation that regulated this or that and took this away and took that away. Whether you're a homeowner, even just the way they were putting meters on all of your public utilities, and then electricity would go down, and they would say, all right, we're shutting off the meter for everybody for these 3 hours.
Right.
Holy cow! This is like Nepal has better electrical management than that, right? It was
than California.
It was
Yeah.
crazy,
Right.
and that we would have those kind of brownouts in the United States, and that further the state would have a hand in regulating that. And to watch this really heavy-handed government move through was sort of intimidating as a citizen of California.
Sure.
And we thought it was going to only get worse, which of course it has. Now you see, you must buy this kind of car. Oh, but if you have this kind of car, you can't drive it.
Right.
That's an insane process that we see. I think we're seeing it here coming and creeping into Washington State.
From Inslee trying to follow Governor Newsom and trying
Completely,
to imitate whatever didn't work in California, let's try to implement it here.
And our legislature has been controlled by one party for, let's be realistic, like almost 40 years. And it's doing the same thing. And I think that was a big part for me really on the initiatives, was that when you see one party rule that lasts for 20 or 30 years, and I don't care which party it is, when one party rules for 30 or 40 years, I believe they become a little bit arrogant and calloused and unconcerned about any other voices than the ones that they hear themselves. And that means that your laws become one-sided and they don't take into account how everyday average people live. And that's certainly what I think has happened here in Washington State. And there was a need to push back.
And Brian, I want to talk now about this pushback a little bit, but I think what we're going to do is we're going to have to do that in the next video chapter. So if you're watching this video right now, just stay tuned for part 2. We're going to talk about the pushback with Brian Heywood and everything he's been doing in Washington State.